Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all to today's discussion on inclusive constitution making on the path to peace. My name is Sarah Taylor. I'm leading on IPI's Women, Peace and Security work. And I would like to first thank, right at the front, our partners on this event, Inclusive Security and the Permanent Mission of Estonia to the UN. I'm delighted to have a distinguished panel here today, both here and remotely. We will have one colleague who's joining via VTC. To discuss the importance of inclusive constitution reform, both in terms of what research tells us about previous efforts in this regard, and in terms of opportunities to ensure future processes are, in fact, inclusive. And of course, I am particularly interested in the specificities of women's participation and women's rights in these efforts. But before we begin with the panelists, I would like to welcome His Excellency Mr. Sven Jurgensen, Permanent Representative of Estonia to the United Nations, to the stage for some initial thoughts on this subject. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see there are so many of you. And first of all, I would like to say that it is an honor for Estonia to be part of this timely event with IPI on inclusive security and constitution making in the wake of conflict. Inclusivity across the board and inclusive decision making is something that Estonia has believed in and advocated for. Such an approach will benefit peaceful societies as well as the ones emerging from conflict. Constitution making is a frequent component of a peace or transition process, and 75 countries undertook significant constitutional reforms between 1990 and 2015, including Estonia. We all agree that there are too many conflicts in the world in dire need for a solution, including the catastrophic situation in Syria. In the path to lasting peace, constitution making has been and will be an important angle to keep in mind. It can give an opportunity to build trust and acknowledge the reasons that may have contributed to conflict in the first place, making it therefore also an important tool in peace building. The 62nd session of the Commission on the Status of Women successfully concluded just a few days ago, but this important topic must remain at the core of our everyday discussions. Research has shown that gender equality is a greater predictor of peace than a country's wealth or levels of democracy, and I am sure we will hear more about it during the discussions later on today. Between 1990 and 2015, only 1 in 5 constitution drafters was a woman, although women's participation levels vary from process to process. The proportion of women in constitution-making bodies has been recently increasing, though, from an average of 13% between 1990 and 1995 to an average of 24% between 2010 and 2015. But even if women become more often part of the constitution-making process, they still face an unproportional amount of challenges. So, besides the need to increase women's participation in the constitution-making processes, we also must ensure that their voices are adequately heard. With this note, let me conclude whilst looking forward to informative presentations and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for a really nice framing moment of where we are and what the challenges are that still remain. We're now going to begin with our discussion amongst the panelists. If I could invite them to the stage, to their relevant seats. So, I would like to introduce our discussants today, both here and virtually. First, I'd like to introduce Ms. Mariam Jalabi. She is a founding member of the Syrian Women's political movement and the co-chairperson of that movement's Foreign Relations Committee. She is the representative of the Syrian Opposition Coalition to the United Nations here in New York. And she has led the Syrian opposition's diplomatic engagement with the United Nations, UN Department of Political Affairs, and the UN and the Office of the UN Secretary General. And I'd also like to say that she has been a staunch supporter of women's participation and women's rights in those efforts. Next, we have Mr. Rohan Edersina, who is Senior Political and Constitutional Advisor at the Policy and Mediation Division of the United Nations Department of Political Affairs, DPA. I think you'll all be clear that there are many acronyms in there. He has worked on constitutional processes in Nepal and Sri Lanka and has extensive experience in research and academia on this issue as well. Next, we have Ms. Maria O'Reilly, who is co-author of the report that you will have seen around here, which is part of the framing for today's event. She is the Director of Research and Analysis at Inclusive Security, where she examines why women's inclusion matters for peace and how this inclusion can be achieved. She designs institutional research strategies, oversees multi-country research projects, and formulates evidence-based policy recommendations. And then, of course, joining us via VTC is Ms. Amira Yahwi. I'm really sorry if I am mispronouncing your last name. Amira has been deeply involved in Tunisia in the promotion of human rights and good governance. This is including through the organization that she founded, Al Baswala, a public policy and accountability NGO that has won multiple awards for its work. And she herself is, in fact, a recipient of multiple international awards in recognition of her human rights work. So I'm absolutely delighted that you're all here with us in some manner to have this discussion today. So, as noted, we're really looking forward to this sort of interactive and robust conversation. I'm going to start with a first round of questions on how inclusive constitution making relates to peace building. And I'm going to ask Marie the first question. Can you set the stage for us, Marie? There's this new report that you're a co-author of on this exact issue, and we'd really like to hear the key findings about the connections between drafting a new constitution and broader peace and transition processes.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for hosting us, and to everyone at IPI, and indeed to the Mission of Estonia, Mr. Ambassador, and also to the fellow panelists and the co-author of this research, Nanako Tamaru, who will be joining us shortly. At Inclusive Security, some of you may know, we've worked for many years on supporting women's participation in peace processes. But what we were finding recently was more and more women were asking us about how they can influence initiatives to reform their country's constitutions. These initiatives were happening very often alongside the peace negotiations or the transition process that they were involved in. What we realized that there seemed to be a lack of guidance for women looking to get involved in these constitution-making processes in the wake of conflict and unrest. And when we really delved into it, while there's some literature on gender equality in the provisions of constitutions and great textual analysis, there was a little bit less out there on how women actually get access to these processes, how they influence them, what challenges they face when trying to do so. So that was kind of the area that we started looking into in this research and drawing on 8 case studies, trying to unpack some of the different dynamics within that. And what we found, as the ambassador highlighted, was this is actually a very frequent occurrence. Constitution making is frequently part and parcel of a peace or transition process. 75 countries, we found, undertook some sort of significant constitution reform in the wake of conflict or unrest between 1990 and 2015. And in addition, we found that in these settings, women's participation is quite low. Over that time period, just 1 in 5 women participated as drafters in these constitution-making bodies. Now, that number has certainly gone up. Fortunately, we did see a positive trend line between 1990 and 2015. At the same time, we're nowhere close to gender equality, and women continue to face a lot of challenges, which we can get into later. Interestingly, what we found in terms of the impact that women have when they do participate, first and foremost, the most visible element across the cases was that women very frequently come together, despite divisions on many other issues. They come together to promote provisions within the Constitution that will advance gender equality and inclusion in the society thereafter. And as we know, equality and inclusivity closely correlates with peace. We also found that frequently they were sort of modeling a microcosm of peace building as they were doing so, because they very frequently were setting aside very acute grievances related to the conflict between them in order to pursue this joint agenda. In addition, I suppose the third element that really came forth was women's organizations in civil society, when they did get involved in the process, time and again, their elements seem to be contributing to broadening societal participation in the process. Of course, that's not to say there are plenty of mixed gender civil society organizations doing the same, but that really seemed to be the calling card of women's groups in civil society. Was they were reaching out to more and more citizens, trying to channel their input into the process and raise awareness as to what the process was about. Kind of increasing, one could argue, the legitimacy of the process ultimately, and cementing that social compact that was being created. So in South Africa, for example, the Women's National Coalition reached out to an estimated 2 million women across linguistic, racial, and cultural divides, and solicited inputs for them, channeling them into a charter of priorities for the new South African Constitution. And many of these priorities were ultimately reflected in the text. So we can see that despite a real low level of participation, when women do get involved, they very often are bridging divides, particularly in relation to the agenda that they can agree on, which time and again seem to be that gender equality agenda and the inclusion of other traditionally marginalized groups. And also they're broadening the social compact that's being created when they are actively engaging as women's groups in civil society.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marie. I'm actually going to ask the next question of Rohan, if you're prepared for me to switch the order up a little bit. A number of the points that Marie's already raised about broadening the social contract, about that outreach, about the different ways that that inclusivity, how that inclusivity can work. I'm wondering if you can speak to the work that you've done on constitution reform processes in a variety of settings, and talk about how these processes can potentially exacerbate divisions, as well as building peace, that we sort of can't take for granted that these processes are going to have one outcome. What role does inclusion play in these processes?
Thank you. Well, I think the short answer is that post-conflict constitution making can actually exacerbate difference, because especially after a peace agreement is signed, you often find that the peace agreement requires then the particular country concerned to address the root causes of conflict. And in many of the conflicts around the world today, you find that they're intra-state. They have to grapple with issues of exclusion, of discrimination, with the horrible reality, if you like, of identity politics. And so if you're really going to use the Constitution as an instrument that is going to perhaps lay some sort of foundation for peace, you've got to address the root causes of the conflict. Now, as soon as you do that, you're going to have the challenge of sometimes the different groups having very different perceptions as to what the cause of the conflict is. They will have different interpretations of what caused the conflict and what needs to be addressed. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, we have the challenge of even contested histories. Yeah, the different ethnic groups have their own interpretations of history. So, who was there first? Was there a separate, kingdom in a particular part of the island? And so you've got to deal with all that. And as soon as you open that kind of issue up for debate, you're going to have perhaps increased polarization. But I think you can't get away from that. And a lot will depend on how that is managed. hopefully the parties who have signed the peace agreement and who want to sort of engage in some sort of dialogue and use constitutional reform as a basis for resolution of the conflict will recognize that there is a need for compromise, that there's a need to listen to the other and try to understand the other, even if you might not agree with the other. And so I think that's really an enormous challenge. So when you're confronted with that challenge, I think broadening the debate, involving a wider range of stakeholders will actually help. So, for example, in the Sri Lankan context, not just the two big communities, the Sinhalese and the Tamils, who were really having to deal with the conflict, but bringing in the other groups, the other ethnic groups, and of course, widening the group of stakeholders as much as possible, bringing in civil society, and bringing in women as well, because I think then it helps to give everything a sense of perspective. You begin to become more aware of the fact that you're not just dealing with your own problems, you're dealing with a wider range of issues. There is a need for compromise, there's a need to listen and try to understand the other. So yes, there is a risk, but I do think that it's an unavoidable risk. And if you're really going to, design a constitution that is going to bring about a reasonably durable peace, or at least start that process, you have to sometimes confront those difficult issues.
No, that's a tremendously important point. Thank you. That the risk exists regardless, and that the inclusive process helps you deal with it in a way that is much more substantive looking into the future. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn to Miriam next. And I think, it would be really helpful for you to give us an an outline, help us understand a little bit more the role of constitution making in the Syrian process to date. Maybe give us an idea of some of the recent developments in this regard and what you see unfolding in the future. A little bit.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you, IPI, and the Mission of Estonia for sponsoring this. Mary O'Reilly for doing this amazing research, and my co-panelist and moderator for being here doing this very important work. And I would like to put it in a different context for Syria. We're talking post-conflict. Now, when you refer to it and you're talking about building constitution and then talking about peace building after a peace agreement has been done. For Syria, we are in a raging conflict right now. And it somehow has become one of the big and center issues that has being discussed right now for Syria as a constitution. Before I go into the detail and explain a little bit of what's happening in that regard, I'd like to give the context, like right now, I'd like to remind people that this past month has some of the highest incidents and casualties in Syria being carried by the regime and its allies in eastern Ghouta. There has been a Security Council resolution 2401 that has not been implemented, and people are suffering until today, being demographically changed, being tortured, being bombed, being killed, not given full access to medical care or to food or to any humanitarian aid. This is the context that Syria lives in today. So when we're sitting and discussing constitution, we need to remember that having a constitution alone, no matter how perfect that constitution may be, is not going to be the solution unless it's implemented. And here I'd like to remind people also that in 2012, the regime itself had actually modified and corrected the constitution in few ways and few elements that had made it more palatable for people, and they lifted the emergency law at that time. And if that constitution is actually being implemented today, we wouldn't be living the atrocities that we would be living. Just for example, a person in Syria under the constitution has the right to a lawyer, has the right to a fair trial. And that is not being practiced in Syria. People are arbitrarily arrested, people are thrown in jail, executive executions, field executions, people disappearing is a daily occurrence. People is living that reality. So sitting in Geneva, now we're at the 9th round, and have not come to much of a resolution, shows that just talking about certain elements of what could be changed inside Syria does not work unless you have a full comprehensive solution for the state of Syria. Staffan de Mistura has put forward 4 baskets or 4 issues to be discussed in Geneva, which are the constitution, elections, a transitional governing body, and terrorism. Terrorism was actually added by the regime, and we've accepted it, thinking, yes, there are terrorists in Syria, and we need to make it into a safe place. So the constitution is one of these baskets that's being discussed in Syria. So what happened is that the regime and its allies, the Russians, have focused on trying to create a constitution for Syrians, thinking that this may be creating a solution for what's happening in Syria. But creating a constitution for Syria requires having a neutral and a safe environment for it to take place. Any processes for building a constitution needs the right environment for it. In order to create that right environment, you will need some kind of a transition on the ground, some kind of a safety on the ground where people feel the safety to come to a referendum and to sit and choose their constitution. That cannot happen separately now being discussed in Geneva, which is happening actually right now. Mm-hmm. And if you're following a little bit of the Syria news, there was the Sochi conference that had taken place a couple of months ago that was organized by Russia. And the main focus of that was to create a committee for building the constitution. And they had 150 members that were selected, third regime, third opposition, third other parties, and which was adopted by the UN as an outcome. And de Mistura said that he would be creating his own committee for the constitution. And this is an ally of the regime, and the regime rejected, actually, this whole mechanism and this outcome for building the constitution. When it comes to the, I'll try to answer some of the questions because Syria is complicated. There are a lot of issues that we could address, but I'm trying to give a simple overview of what's happening in regards to the constitution. So when de Mistura had taken up creating the committee, talking about inclusion, the words that the SG used after the Sochi conference, adopting the outcomes of Sochi conference, said that the third of the constitutional committee will be the regime, third of it will be the opposition, and third of it will be civil society, tribes, and women. When we're putting women, and this kind of a description was used later on by many other people, including the special envoy himself. When you're specifying half of society that needs to be part of this referendum, this building of the constitution as a component, as part of a special group within constitutional making, it's very problematic for us as Syrian women. And as Syrian Women political movement, we have actually relayed our messages to the SG and to the special envoy and to the opposition that this is not acceptable. Women have to be at 50% in building any of these committees and any of these solutions for Syria, and that has to happen regardless of what component of the opposition or the regime or the other groups, the civil society. One more element that I want to address also is that the Syrian constitution is for the Syrians to decide on and for the Syrians to build. The way the Syrian crisis right now is that it's been a proxy war, an international meddling, an international conflict. It's not just the Syrian conflict anymore. But when it comes to the building of the constitution itself, to protect the rights of all Syrians, under a law that treats everyone equally, it has to be done by Syrians. It has to be done in an environment where all Syrians can participate. Mm-hmm. And that cannot happen unless you have the government or the state or the environment that will support that.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Miriam. You know, the reminder of so many important points, including the worth of a document is only in how much it is actually implemented. Yes. And how much enforcement there is of it. Right down to the issue that I think, at least on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, we grapple with so often, which is a sort of siloing small space open for women on the sidelines, or genuine, true, meaningful participation throughout these processes. And then also a reminder that this is a truly political process. And speaking to Rohan's points about the need to to go through the difficult process of consultation, but the necessary process.
Yes.
So I'm now going to turn to Amira, who's joining us on the screens over here. Amira, I'm wondering if, given the interventions that we've heard already, if you can speak to some of the experience that you had in Tunisia, and what contributions you think the constitution drafting process had on a relatively peaceful transition in Tunisia after the revolution, and what impact efforts to increase public participation and oversight might have had. So, Amira.
Thank you very much, and I would have loved to be with you in DC, but thanks to technology, I feel like I'm there. First of all, you just said a very important sentence, which is the worth of a document, it's just the worth of the paper. And I actually agree and don't agree with this. In the Tunisian case, for example, we went from the worthless documents that were just paper, which was the constitution under the dictatorship, the constitution under the Ben Ali regime, to a very worthy case. And the only difference between the two is who wrote this document, who feels that this document represents them. We used to have a document written by a bunch of dictators and their allies and friends, and we ended up having a document written by the people, and that gave a strong value to the document itself, but still it's only paper. So to talk a bit about the Tunisian constitution, so for those who are not familiar with Tunisia, we are the ones who started all this trouble in the region. Means some people call it the Arab Winter. For us, it was a spring. Tunisia went from a dictatorship to a democracy. We are today the only democracy in the Middle East. And that actually was we achieved that through two things. And if you what I'm going to say today, you will find a lot of Tunisians who will not agree with it. And I would say most of the Tunisian elite won't agree with it. So what happened in Tunisia is that we gave literally the power to the people. Not of the people that we used to see on TV, the people who are the people who already had a certain access to power, a certain access to the exterior, but the people, the normal people of Tunisia, and I would say the 99%. We had an election in 2012 where the reaction was completely up from a group to another. The first group was shocked. We saw faces in that assembly that doesn't look at all like what we're used to see in a parliament. And other people saw faces that actually looked like them, because Tunisia in 2012 did not vote for constitutional experts, did not vote for diplomats, did not vote for politicians, and did not vote for lawyers and people with huge, big degrees, impressive curriculums, but voted for just like the normal people that you wouldn't trust with your constitution. Means we had taxi drivers, we had jobless women, we had the wife and the sister and the daughter, and we had the uncle and the grandpa all there writing in constitution. And I can tell you, I mean, if you look at it, you would think this is a reality show, not a parliament. And most of them, like 95% of them, had no clue what even, I think, they never read the constitution of their life. But still they wrote, and they wrote a beautiful one. They wrote one of the most, I would say, open, I personally think I personally couldn't expect a better constitution, and I think that I am from the so-called like elite who has that access. So what happened is, first of all, we had a huge turnout for especially for women. So and especially for a Muslim country. So we had more than 26% of women elected and ended up with 30% women in the parliament. And that's not because we are open-minded or anything. That's just because of a simple logic, which is called quota. And I am still shocked that some people still want to argue if that is good or not in the country. And the second thing, what we had is that we made that process totally open, and this is actually the work of Al Baltala, the NGO I work with, and I founded. Our idea was, you're there to represent the people. You are working for each and every one of us, and every single thing you're doing will be out. And we make everybody have access to that. It was a very difficult fight, but we ultimately succeeded, and we ended up voting for the Tunisian constitution, ended up voting for an access to information article, while in the beginning, most of them, I mean, I even had an MP who wanted to literally kick me. And that MP on herself voted for access to information at the end. So what happened is, in the beginning, when we voted for the whole process to get at Constitutional Assembly was one. We want to write the Constitution that we want to write a Constitution that will express our dream for. And we ended up writing.
Sorry, you're just cutting in and out a little bit, and I'm also going to, since I'm interrupting you, I'm going to take the prerogative to just ask you to wrap up this particular answer, because we'll have another opportunity for you.
Yes,
thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm changing here, but actually I can hear your mic, so that's why I think it cuts the anyway, so just one thing. What we did is, in the beginning, we had as an ideal to write a constitution that will express the ideal, our dream. And we ended up spending 3 years discussing who we are, what we are, how do we define ourselves. And we wrote a constitution not about our ideal, but about what we are, what will govern us today, and what will work for us. And this is why I think the inclusiveness of this process is so impressive, because for the first time in the history of Tunisia, Tunisians were able to discuss and to talk together, and no one defined Tunisia but the people.
Thank you so much, Amira. I think this is an incredibly important point, is that as we've been discussing already here today, it's that definition of inclusion, identity, is something that does take time. It is a process that can be helped by particular structural and process measures like quotas. As you note, not everybody has bought into that idea, but they are effective, or can be effective. But that having that time to sort of define for yourselves who you are, the as you say, as you mentioned, not just two main groups, but a multiplicity of identities and groups, that's really crucial. I'm going to start our second round of questions now. I'll ask I ask that we keep our interventions relatively brief so that we have time for Q&A from the audience. I'm going to start with Rohan. We're focusing in this round of question on the challenges and opportunities. Yeah, so now we've talked about the importance and sort of how that's worked. Now let's talk about the challenges and opportunities in practice. So Rohan, to you first. What challenges have different countries faced, and including a variety of stakeholders and identity groups in this constitution making? And it would be wonderful if you could give us a cheat sheet about the best practices. What should we all be doing?
Well,
Yep.
Well, as Miriam pointed out in her response, one of the challenges is, of course, that the term inclusion covers many, many things. So in many parts of the world, for example, in South Asia, which I'm a little bit more familiar with, the term inclusion would be interpreted to mean inclusion of the different ethnic groups. And so, so one of the challenges then is when that is the sort of predominant consideration in the minds of the parties to the conflict and potential mediators or whatever, to remind them that inclusion also means inclusion of women and other groups. And sometimes that's a challenge. Now, persuading the parties to the conflict is a bit difficult because sometimes they insist. They say, no, we don't want anyone else at the table. Yeah? We have been waging this struggle, we want to engage with the government concerned, and we don't want anyone else at the table. Yeah? And very often, of course, these parties are 100% men or male. So how do you then, so I think you need to think through the strategy to try and ensure then that you try and broaden the participation as much as possible and make sure that women's engagement too is a priority in setting the agenda. So for example, in Sri Lanka, you had the Tamil Tigers, for example, saying we don't want anyone else at the table. We have been waging a struggle against the government of Sri Lanka. And so not only women, but other significant ethnic minorities were also left out. And so the facilitators had to think creatively. Yeah? High table, low table, do you bring them in at a certain point? And it is a challenge. The second, of course, is the relationship between the peace agreement and constitution making. So this is rather difficult. Now in Nepal, the peace agreement, fortunately, contained a number of references to a new constitution. And there were references not only to the substance of the new constitution, but also the process by which the constitution was going to be drafted. Yeah? And that was for very specific historical reasons. The idea of the constitutional commissions had become totally discredited, and so it was very important that the new constitution for a new Nepal had to be drafted and adopted by an elected, inclusive constituent assembly. Now that was there in the peace agreement. So it was extremely useful. It was a useful reference because as the process wore on, and as you know in Nepal it dragged on and on, the timelines weren't met, there was a kind of a conservative pushback from the conservative elite that was hoping that the change agenda could be sort of stymied and prevented. And the international community was able constantly to refer to the peace agreement, which all these parties, including the conservative groups, signed on to, and which called upon the international community actually to assist with respect to full implementation. Yeah? And I think, Mariam, you raised that important point about implementation. I think it's important to have a sense of perspective because sometimes just getting something put into a constitution can be strategically very useful for the future. Yeah? And sometimes, you know that some of these provisions or principles may not be implementable immediately, but it's good to put it in the Constitution because then, when the time is right, you can always refer back to it. And in a sense, that's what a Constitution is all about. It sets out certain norms and principles. There's a realization now that implementation is important. There's far greater sensitivity to that point. But I do think one shouldn't get too hung up on that because you have to recognize that getting it put in the Constitution, I think, is very important. So on some good practices, let me briefly respond to that point. I do think, and I think, Mari, in your report, you highlight this, getting the term or the principle of inclusion accepted as early as possible in the process is very important. Or even getting that term put in, because people might not realize that it includes women. But if you put that in, then you can say, well, look, if you're going to include the different ethnic groups, then surely, if you accept the principle, you have to also include that women have also got to be involved. And I think that's very important. And in Nepal, I can say that, fortunately, the principle of inclusion was accepted very early in the process, and that is what helped to ensure that there was a reasonable amount of women's participation in the process. It wasn't ideal, but at least it prevented a kind of backtracking, which I think in certain parts of the world can be seen as a kind of achievement, preventing backtracking.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think, no, that is on. Yes. No, I think a really, really crucial point about planting helpful language, but then also needing to have the ability to take advantage of that, and what that means for, as we're talking about here to a certain degree, women's rights organizations, but also, international supporters of a peace process or of a constitution-making process, helping them to understand that opportunity lies in the text, even though it's not a huge, but understanding that there can be a strategy built around that kind of inclusion is really important. Amira, I'm going to turn back to you again for just a little bit more on this issue of the particular tactics, the challenges and successes of some of the tactics that you employed, and particularly if you could talk, you talked about the quota a little bit, but if you want to speak a little bit more about some of the what you employed in the Tunisian context, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me well? Ideally, you will cut off the mic from your side because I can hear myself talking. Okay, we're good. So in Tunisia, for our first elections, we implemented quotas, and that does not mean having 20 or 30 or 40% for women, but have every list should have half men and half women, and if the list starts with the man, the second should be a woman, and the third man, and the fourth woman, etc. So we assure, of course, that at least the number 2 in the list will be a woman and get the maximum of women elected. Of course, almost every list had a man on top of the list and then a woman. But that guaranteed the minimum, which was around the third of the assembly being women. Now, what happened is that Tunisia was branded as a very pro-women country, and this is one of the reasons why people loved Ben Ali, the former dictator. This is why people loved Mubarak. This is why people loved Bashar al-Assad, and this is why people love all these dictators like the Saudi Arabian young prince that we have today, that everybody's in love with, because branding the country as being pro-women, which is absolutely not true. So in Tunisia, for example, that branding actually made women have even have like a false judgments of ourselves, because we ended up believing in our lies. And then we found ourselves in a democracy, and we discovered that actually we were really far from having a real agreement on the status of women in the country, means equality. So during 3 years, we had every single debate you can imagine, but each time the debate comes to equality, then it blocks. Every debate you can imagine, it's on gender equality, it's on access to election, to important positions, and whatever name it, economic rights, whatever name it, it blocks when it comes to women. And then we had to discuss this woman article, this equality article, and that equality article, we started it in 2012, and it was voted for 3 years after. And then during the 3 years, we come back and forth, and we discuss it again. Ultimately, we voted for it. So today, constitutionally, and after 3 years of discussions, men and women in Tunisia are equal. But even with that, and we have it in the constitution, every day until today, we're debating what does mean equal. So, for example, for those who are following Tunisia today, we are discussing equality in inheritance, because we're a Muslim country and women inherit half of a man. And so we're still saying, okay, we're equal in political rights, we're equal in economic rights, but are we really equal on this? We don't know. We're still discussing it. And we will continue discussing if we're equal in, I don't know, pants size, if we're equal in holidays, if we're equal whatever, in eating fruits. I don't know. I mean, whatever stupid thing that we can discuss, we will discuss it, and we will be like discussing it for the coming 20 years. But what happened in the Constitutional Assembly, and that was so impressive, that the fact that we had these quotas, we got actually women elected by force. So they were not prepared to be in this assembly. We didn't have women who were what we call the so-called competent for the role. We had women who have nothing to do with this, but they ended up actually writing this constitution because women were those who were making the committee's work. They were able to discuss with each other from the extreme left to the extreme right. They are the only one time that all women, a group of people from different point of views united in the assembly was when women decided to unite to push forward this article. And actually, they united while within themselves, they had people who were thinking. I mean, I had a woman MP who told me that a woman can never be equal to men because women have 7 grams less brain than men, and she was still in that. Yeah, it is what, and she was still in that women group that was lobbying for the women question together, that was really impressive. I mean, ultimately, she was okay that we have 7 grams less, but we can be still equal. So that was good. And what we've seen also, and this is something we did with Al-Bawsila, is that we calculated participation. But we didn't calculate it by days. We calculated by seconds. We calculated by minutes. And we discovered that, first of all, in terms of attendance in the parliament, we had while we had 80% of attendance for women, we had like about 40 for men. In committees, we saw that each time we reach a consensus and we reach a solution, it was led by a woman or by the majority of the group was women. And I can go on for this. I mean, we had so many facts that they were not about what we lobby for, but these were like facts and numbers. And every time you see success, you saw women and women leading in committees. The very smart thing we did is that we had a woman head of the Rights and Freedoms Committee, and that was one of the most sensitive. And the reason why I think that this constitution was so ahead of its times for Tunisia, but also so pro-human rights and so pro-next generation's rights and so pro-earth rights and so pro-everything was because we had so many women participating in the rights articles. So then, I mean, of course, that was a success. And the impact of that was that because we have the law, because they succeeded in showing why they are a real added value to the process, in the second elections, every party was seeking to get the more women inside the party, to give more power, because they wanted women to get elected and not fill the seats just with random people just to fill up the list. And that had another impact, which was we saw the creation of many NGOs for women in politics. We saw political parties trying to get the maximum and attract the maximum of young women inside the political parties to give way more power to women in politics. And this is what makes it beautiful. Sometimes it shows that you are forced to, you're not even convinced by, usually when that choice means getting a woman involved, it ends up being a good choice, and they will, I mean, women, I truly believe that when you've been excluded, you're the best to work in inclusion. Because when you were trying to get that seat, the moment you get the seat, you want to share it with the maximum of people who are outside.
So much. Very, very powerful. I'm sort of trying to take notes and turn my microphone back on and absorb everything that you're saying. I think your very first point about defining equal is a really important one, but also this issue about preparation, about what it means to have been the excluded group and what preparation you need to do and how much work you need to do to make the case to yourself and to your colleagues and to show the results. These are sort of complex and simultaneous projects. And it actually gives me the opportunity to turn to Miriam and to talk to you about, you've laid out just a brief overview of both the dire situation in Syria, but also the way the political process is sort of unfolding, and your pushback and your colleagues' pushback on the idea of sort of plucking the constitution making out from the sort of other efforts that are ongoing and that are necessary. With all of that being said, it would be wonderful to hear from you about the prospects for women's inclusion in a constitutional committee, but a constitutional committee as a sort of way of saying a constitutional process that's effective and impactful. I wonder if you can talk to
Now listening to Amira, I wanna share a story. Is that when we were in Riyadh this past November to create a reconstruction of the opposition or restructuring of the opposition to include more groups in, there were three seats that were given to women, and we were about 20 women there, and we had to fight over 3 seats, and it was not it was just like the fight that was happening among the men. The same thing was happening among the women, who's going to be taking those seats. Anyways, all of this is happening, and then the statement for the communique for Riyadh 2 comes out, and it says the inclusion of women up to 30%. And there were no differences at that time anymore among all of the women present. We were all on one page. It has to be at least 30%. Just a few minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, we were outside the room. It was a big room, one of those big conference rooms in Riyadh, where you have about 150 people, sitting in this one big spot, and we all have our mics there, and all of the women who were outside we're making our own blocks, our own fights in who takes what seat, and how do we create more representation for women. When we sat down, we all held our mics and said at least 30%. Our differences disappeared at that point. Is that we all need to have more women representation. Saying that, I want to go to my next point, which is about the US Senate had hit a record of representation for women by appointing the last senator that hit 22%. And from what I just learned, also one of the statistics is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has 1 woman among 21. So when we're talking about the inclusion of women in the Syrian process, in the constitutional making, in the transition, we're not talking a Syrian phenomena. We are talking a global phenomena, where women are not at the decision-making tables worldwide. Women's presence in governments worldwide is at 18%. And that's actually kind of skewed because you've got Sweden and Norway and Finland, the Scandinavian countries, kind of tilting that average. So when you really think about it, it's not just about including women in the Syrian process, it's about including women in the global process of peacebuilding and peacemaking. So that's our biggest challenge as Syrians. We receive, with every invitation we get to Geneva, we actually receive annexed to the letter of invitation 1325, Resolution 1325 for inclusion of women by the Special Envoy, which I find really interesting and amusing because everybody who's sitting at the table, even at the UN, and people who are discussing Syria are very, very dominated by the men's presence. So unless we address this issue from a completely different point of view, where we are, as Syrian women, in the same plight with the rest of the women in building constitution and making governments in the world, we're not going to be able to reach a solution for Syria to have 30% women sitting at the table. I totally also agree with Amira, and also what you said, Rohan, is that we do need to include provisions and in writing in the paper what we want. But that becomes very difficult to implement and to create reality on the ground for it when representation is not considered for 50% of society as crucial. So when you're talking about representation of people, of all components, let's say like now, for example, like the Syrian crisis, the opposition was considered divided, it's not very representative, it's not exactly, what's going to bring the solution for Syria. And you'd think, yeah, it does not include 50% of society presented in it. However, what was meant is that we don't include all of the rebels and all of the fighting factions on the ground, because the power is in their hand. Because the power of the people who are making decisions for Syria are the military, are people who have the upper hand, the upper military hand. Like now when you're seeing like who's winning on the ground in Syria, and you see the regime and its allies doing all that they can do to regain back ground and to create the constitution that they think is right for Syria, women are not accounted for at all, because that's a completely different paradigm and different way of thinking. Because it's not the Syrian people who are making the decisions for Syria. It's other interests, it's other interest groups, it's Russia who's sitting next to the regime and creating their own realities on the ground. So unless, it's all of these challenges, it's a global challenge, it's a local challenge, and unless we address them at the same time and looking at a peace resolution together with including 50% of society, at least 30%, I don't believe that we can have any sustainable or lasting peace agreement anywhere, let alone in Syria.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much, Mariam. And as a constant trope in the women, peace and security world and in peace building writ large is, the success rates of peace agreements that are only between men with guns their success rates are far lower than peace agreements that are inclusive, that include women, and that include a whole of society approach. And so, your point on this being a global phenomenon, there are so many examples that we hear from our colleagues in various places about, sort of delegations of international delegations showing up and trying to scold local governments, local actors about where are your women? And it's sort of, why do you not have women at 30% or 50%? And people saying to these international delegations, well, how come you don't have any women on your delegations? So this is truly an international and global phenomenon, and that's not just about it being a right, which it is, and important, which it is, but it's when we're dealing with specific situations, we need to have women's presence to support on delegations to support the women of Syria, the women of whichever case we're talking about. Okay, that was really moderator's prerogative. I was not supposed to be monologuing about that. Couldn't help it. Marie, I'm going to look to you for the final question amongst ourselves before we open up to the floor. That sort of global phenomenon aspect is a nice transition into your research, which looked at women's roles in constitution making in a variety of cases, and for you to speak to what you see in terms of the trends in terms of challenges, but trends also in terms of opportunities.
Thank you. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with this as a global phenomenon. It's also an ancient phenomenon that has been with us for millennia, as is very pleasantly documented in a new book by Mary Beard called Women in Politics. This is something that has quite deep roots and perhaps is why it's so difficult to change. And that's something that we saw in our research, certainly, that across the cases, a lot of the challenges related to an ingrained cultural idea that politics is not a space for women. Mm-hmm. And this manifested itself in a variety of forms. So we frequently heard from the women we interviewed that they were perceived as token members of the body. At every turn, they had to keep proving their legitimacy. Even in Tunisia, where women had played an incredible role at the forefront of the revolution, women we interviewed there really told us many of them, that we're perceived as token representatives. We keep having to prove our authority. It also manifests itself in the form of harassment and threats to women who do participate in these constitution-making processes. That obviously mirrors what we know about women's roles in politics worldwide, where they often, in many different places, encounter a much higher rate of attacks and harassment. And it also kind of manifested itself in broader social norms. So, for example, we heard Amira talking about how women actually had higher rates of attendance in the committees within the Constituent Assembly in Tunisia, and yet in the media, when they were interviewing Constituent Assembly members, would almost always interview men to speak about what was happening in the committee, even when men hadn't been in attendance in the session in question. So this is getting perpetuated and reinforced from many different angles, and it's a very tricky problem to overcome. And then, of course, these things are all related to women's roles in society more broadly, and equality at a much more social level as well as an economic level. Many women told us that the votes for that were happening on certain constitutional provisions in Tunisia, this was one example of that, they happened at midnight. And women typically are primary caregivers in their family throughout the world. Showing up for a vote at midnight can be very difficult when if you have a small child to take care of, or you're taking care of an elderly family member. And as we know, those jobs more often fall on women than men at the moment. Finally, we had this frequent subordination of so-called women's issues, which we hear about in peace processes as well. And this is a theme that continues on into the constitution-making phase. There, for example, in Nepal, while the Women's Caucus secured many provisions relating to gender equality in different ways, one of them, just as one example, that they did not manage to secure fell by the wayside as the earthquake hit. There was a new push to finally and very quickly wrap up this constitution drafting business that had been dragging out for so long. And ultimately, while there was this very inclusive constituent assembly, many suggested that the final decisions were actually taken out of that very inclusive assembly and made by a small number of actors that ultimately ended up excluding a lot of the women who had earned a seat, but also the so-called women's issues that actually affected everyone in society. So there are challenges, but there are also opportunities, and it's not all too depressing, I hope. As the ambassador kindly mentioned at the beginning, we did track a trend of clear and pretty consistent increase over time in women's participation in constitution making. In the early 90s, it was around 13%. From 2010 to 2015, it was up to 24%. And this tracks fairly closely with the levels of women's participation in parliament around the world. The trend lines look quite similar, although just to reiterate that the amount of data that we have on women's roles in constitutions is quite low. So all of these numbers have to be taken with a pinch of salt, because there's a dramatic lack in gender disaggregated data on this topic, as with many others. That being said, when we looked at what women were doing in different places, we saw that the chances of success seemed to increase when they mobilized early, as Rohan mentioned, since the selection procedures for the Constituent Assembly are often set very early on in the peace process. And similarly, when women's participation is incentivized, but in a meaningful way. So Amira outlined very beautifully how that worked in Tunisia with the so-called zipper clause. Some countries had some other kind of quota or mechanism, but sometimes it fell short because it was a third of a third of a third should be women, for example, which relates back to the Syria case, or in Egypt, it was some small proportion of these 10 seats. One of them will be reserved for women. This kind of token effort may indeed lead to token participation, and is something that needs to be addressed. If you're going to incentivize women's participation, do so meaningfully. And that applies obviously not just to the proportion, but also in terms of who gets to participate. A couple of other elements that we found across the cases, often women were more successful in advancing their common agenda where they were working on one, when they worked to build strategic alliances within the Constituent Assembly, often calling on male allies. Powerful men can really do a lot for this agenda, but also broader coalitions outside of the formal process. And again, we saw that beautifully in Tunisia, where Amira and many others were able to exert pressure or promote transparency from civil society and from the outside, while also, in many cases, women inside the Constituent Assembly were liaising with other women in civil society and building those coalitions across the formal process and the broader societal pressure. And finally, we also found that very frequently, when women were able to frame the debate effectively, they were also more successful in advancing their agenda. And what that meant was, really articulating these links between inclusion and peace building that we've been talking about here. That if gender equality and provisions relating to it are included in a constitution, there's a lot of research showing that more inclusive societies, more gender equal societies, strongly correlate with more peaceful societies. And so in countries where women were able to articulate their demands as equal citizens rather than necessarily advocating for women's rights or really linking that inclusion agenda with broader goals that everyone shared for democracy or for stability or for prosperity, they often were able to get further as they pushed for goals around gender equality.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marie. So many practical points. I mean, I think, as we talk about what that meaningful work looks like, when you, exactly as you pointed to with the idea of a zipper list, if you have a whole raft of parties that are sort of one person and you have a man at the top of the zipper list, then you're only getting a male. But zipper lists can be incredibly effective, particularly once you have the sort of self-reinforcing success, as Amira noted, of women showing just how productive they actually are. So much more to say including implicit bias of who gets interviewed, and it's men even when they're not doing the work. But I'm going to stop myself here, and I'm going to throw open to the audience here to ask, to see who has questions for the panelists. So I'll take a few interventions, questions, comments. Be wonderful if you could actually say your name and your institutional affiliation. My colleagues have a microphone if you could use that. So the floor is open to questions. Yes, I have one here.
Thank you. Hello?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Mahima Rai. I am a student from Berlin. I study educational sciences and psychology in Berlin, Freie Universität, and I'm here for the simulation, the National Model United Nations that happens every year. And I got to hear about this event from a professor of mine. I have a question for Mr. Rohan Adrisena. Thank you very much for the insights. Although I study educational science and psychology, I grew up during the civil war in Nepal. And what you say in your work during the time or post-conflict era in Nepal really interests me. You mentioned that one should broaden the circle of stakeholders and in the civil society. And being a mediator yourself, is that the risks are so high because there's so much involved. How can mediation or mediative elements facilitate the inclusion in society without or decreasing the risks, not making it so high, and increasing the chances that the writing of the Constitution is actually implemented? Thanks.
Great, thank you. A very important point about risks and security, I think, throughout these processes. Yes.
Yes, my name is Jonathan Granoff. I'm the president of the Global Security Institute, and I'll ask my question, and then I'll give the background of it. I'd like you to give. I think that there should be equal representation of women as a moral issue. It doesn't have to have a utilitarian justification. It's an issue of equal rights of human beings. But I'd like some examples of societies in which there has been this transformation of the inclusion of women and how that has tangibly, practically impacted policies. And the reason I ask this is that during the Obama administration, on the issue that I'm most concerned with, which is nuclear weapons, we had a Secretary of State who was a woman, a Deputy Secretary of State who was a woman, the Assistant Secretary of State on Nuclear Nonproliferation who was a woman, the CD Ambassador who was a woman, the Deputy Assistant. You had to go 6 levels down before you got a man. Mm-hmm. And yet they ended up pledging $1 trillion to modernize the arsenal and no substantial progress on disarmament. Even though we had all of these women, it was a terrible disappointment for me personally. So I'd like tangible examples in which just the gender difference has created really, really transformative policies.
Great, thank you. I've got 2. So I'm going to actually Amanda. That's okay. I'll just do Amanda and then you. Yeah? So Amanda?
Hi, Amanda from UNDPA. I'd like to ask my DPA colleague one question, which is, Miriam, you outlined very clearly that the constitutional process that is yet to take off may, in effect, replace a peace agreement. Well, in theory. So my question to my DPA colleague is, can you think of any previous cases, because I haven't been able to find any, where there is actually constitutional reform to address a conflict without a peace agreement prior?
Great. And then we had a comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Hadia Al-Omari, Syrian lawyer and executive member of Damascus Provincial Council. In terms of role of constitution in peace process, I'd like to take this opportunity to shedding the light on the bottom-up approach, in the governance. So here I mean the local administration things, which enhance the democracy and inclusivity as well, and concentrate on the real need of people. So, which is internal, help to ensuring the sustainability of peace of any peace agreement. So, if I have one moment, I will take an example of in the Syrian case. Is it okay?
Good.
So, I would like to mention the Constitution of 2012, Syrian Constitution, which is. It doesn't ensure the right implication of local administration, the decentralization, because even it mentioned to the local administration in its Article 131, but it makes it too general and open. And it refers all the authority to the governor, which in turn appointed by the president and not elected. So, on contrary to the Constitution of 1950, because it mentioned directly to the local administration and decentralization. So, same thing regarding the participation of women. So, all of the previous constitutions of Syria mentioned that to the principle of non-discrimination between men and women. But because of the social situation in Syria, it should be concentrate on quota. A specific percentage of women participation. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so
comment,
much.
Not question.
We're running short on time, so I'll just see if there are just two more points from the audience. Then I'm going to throw back to our panelists, who will be able to give us a bit of both responding to the questions and also some final comments, if that's all right with my colleagues. So I've got one here, and those will be our final two. So you're right there.
Great. Hi, my name is Nana Kotamaru. I'm one of the co-authors of the report with Marie. So glad to see all of you here. I have a question for Miriam and Amira. If you could tell us, many of us in this room here, we are members of international NGOs and other entities. What can we do to help support? What can the international community, NGOs, governments, all of that, what can we do to help support women trying to make a difference in terms of constitution making?
Great, thank you. And then one final comment here.
Thank you. Hello, thank you all for your presentation today. Very informative. I'm a consultant with an NGO network called the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. And it espouses that we're advancing this mindset that living parts of the ecosystem are stakeholders just as much, who are deserving of legal rights just as much as municipalities and corporations and men and women. So to what extent do you expect gender equity within constitution processes to help enhance the ability of ecosystems in the natural environment and their rights to be respected? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So for this final sort of set of responses from the panelists, I'm going to start from my right. So Amira, any reflections on the points and questions, and then any one or two points that you want to make in wrap up. Thank you.
I will answer. Sorry, I forget the names, but I will answer Mary's colleague's question. There is a lot that can be done, but there is one thing I was always hurting too when it comes to lobbying for equality in my country specifically. Is that usually the counterexample would be, but look, in the US, there are only 12% of women in Congress. Look, in France, they are only 17. Look, in Europe, in the European Union, there are less than 20. Actually, we're doing way better than these people who are teaching us or want to help us. So usually what I ask for is really, we really need to solve the problem globally. Sometimes the problem is closer to you than what you think. It is, forget about the Scandinavian countries, but the other two countries where I think there are more than 50% representations of women in parliament are two African countries. I think Kenya, and I forget what is the second other country. Something that I do, and I think every woman should do, is that to always refuse to be in a room with only men. Not for sexual harassment, for actual discussions. I always find it super terrible to be in the UN. Personally, I refuse it. An incredible number of meetings in the UN. The only times I am in a balanced room, it's when it's UN Women or CEDAW. But usually, whenever I'm in security, whatever call it, I will be most of the time alone, if not 2 among 12. Always refuse to participate to meetings and to panels with only men, and not even attend them. So don't be even in the room, and leave. So and these are things that look very small, but actually I think we women in NGOs and in the political sphere, I would call it, for many women in our countries, call it the women who made it. We women who made it, let's say, we need to seriously be quite radical with our participation, and where we accept to be part of, and to refuse every single call, meeting, press, anything where we're alone. We should not look at being alone as a privilege. It is not. It is not good for our ego. It should not be good for our ego. We should actually be heard and not accepted. So, and the second thing is to get more women also is the power of structures that help women understand what's happening outside. The peer-to-peer experience is really super important for women worldwide. I remember when we started discussing this, when we started working on getting this constitutional right, the equality between men and women, most of the time actually the person who helped us the most was Google, while probably we could have at that time participated more, seen other women who were in constitutional processes, talking to constitutional women, women in constitutions, working in constitution, and these kind of examples. This is something I personally do a lot. I am in contact with many women who are either in countries where they are trying to change constitutional laws, or in countries that are hopefully when they become democracies and know they will have to go through rewriting the constitution. So this is also something like the links and the peer-to-peer experience and the contacts are very, very powerful and empowering, rather than books or Google.
Jamira. Really very empowering, and particularly because I think we talk a lot about, structures and institutions, and really helpful to hear what we as individuals should be doing, even if it's something as sort of, nope, I'm not attending that meeting and I really, it can be a very, very powerful message. So, and amongst the other things you said, thank you. Miriam.
I guess continue to what Amira said, and I really like the idea where she says like the peer-to-peer experience, and this is what takes me back to that our struggle as women of the world who are not in enough power decision-making positions to make the world a better place, which I believe we can, comes down for us Syrians, I think, to like few practical issues that I would like to mention. Is that we recently have formed something called the Syrian Women Political Movement. We called it the political movement because we believe that it is very essential that we believe women can be political. So much of the work that's being done worldwide to help women participate and be part of the process are through civil society groups, which is very important and it's very crucial to have on the ground. And it makes a huge difference. But we need also the support for women to have voices, political voices. And I believe recently Canada has actually put forward a feminist initiative like for women's voices. And it doesn't say exactly political, but I'm interpreting it to mean so, that actually to help women have a political voice. And this is very natural for women to have, and they shouldn't only be put in the stereotypical and the corners that we have always have been put in, humanitarian aid, psychosocial support, education, and all of that. They can be in political making, in decision making, political decision making places. The other thing that I wanted to say also is that some of the solutions that we have found that the international community has used recently, which I kind of value and appreciate, what Special Envoy Stefan de Mistura has done for creating the Women Advisory Board to help him, in running the mediation process, the talks, and all of that, which is really crucial. And Hadia Al-Amari and myself actually became part of the other committee that was done for the opposition, the Women Advisory Committee. However, I find that sometimes creating these special groups or advisory groups, which were actually by the support, which is like, it's really like me sitting here saying, oh, you did not do the right thing, as international women organizations, is I didn't know also, and I'm always debating back and forth, and a lot of us have these debates back and forth, is it better to have something at hand that's at least trying to influence the decision? But this, from my experience, I feel that it has actually systematically marginalized the placement of women in political and decision-making places. Because now we said, oof, we have a women advisory committee, they'll give us the advice, but yeah, check, the box is checked, so it's done. So the pressure was actually lifted off everyone to have women sitting at the table. That being said, I do want to say Syrian women are actually very tough, and you can't get away with a lot with them. So we have pushed and have been able to include at least like 15% of women now in the negotiations. There are 6 women that are part of a 36 members body that are at the negotiation tables and are discussing, at Geneva. So I think that in comparison to world, politics, and I think in the study also you have like the average is at 9%. So actually we have like when you're doing negotiations, mediations, is that we're at a place where we need to get much better. But I think Syrian women have done so much work to get in that place, and the international community can help in that, in these regards. The third point that I want to mention also is that sometimes the international community or the INGOs or think tanks think that we all women are this very peaceful, like this essential idea about who we are as women, that we can all sit at the same table. Yes, maybe most of us don't carry arms. There are some brigades, of women, but in general, most women do not carry arms and run, brigades on the ground. So it is expected of us to actually sit at the table all of us, from the far right to the far left, every woman possible, and do a full, negotiation and peace talk. And that cannot happen. Women are the same thing. We may not carry weapons and arms, but we are actually just as different in political opinions and ideas and how to find solutions. And this has to be recognized by the international community so that they don't put us in a lump sum one game, and put us at the table and say, here, find a solution for us.
Okay, such an important point. It speaks to what we're talking about here today. It's the diversity of women's opinions and positions is part of the inclusivity that we're talking about here today. And that really gets to this issue of women being political, of there being multiple necessary inflection points so that it's not just about one siloed woman's part over here. It's about ensuring that a diverse section of women are represented across all aspects of a political process.
You say it so much better.
It's only because I've been sitting here crafting
what
it.
I meant.
Been crafting it.
Thank you.
But no,
Yes.
hugely important point. And if we don't get to answer John's question about the women in leadership, that's the broad answer.
It increases the risks for the process if it becomes more inclusive. On the contrary, there's now a growing body of evidence that shows the more inclusive the process, the higher the chances of success, particularly in peace processes and now emerging in constitution making. So I just wanted to flag that in case anyone was anyone shared that idea. In terms of societies where there is significant amounts of gender equality and the difference it has made, I think we can just look at Scandinavia and think about how the pillars of peace have been very securely erected there alongside gender equality and women's participation in politics and many other spheres. And just to come back to Amira's point about the places in the world where women have the highest participation in parliament, many of those countries in that top 10 are indeed in Africa, and they're countries that are not currently in conflict. So I think this requires a lot more time. We'll have to go into another time, but I just wanted to touch on that since no one else did. And I'll leave it there.
Great.
Thank you.
Because clearly we're going to have another discussion about this, or maybe two or three. I want to thank all of you for being a part of this, both here in the room and online. And please, the biggest of thanks to the panelists here in the room and to the Mission of Estonia for supporting this. Thank you.